Our project today is going to be to solder brushes back to brush holders. This is where we take copper brush leads and solder them to metal substrates. The tool I'm going to be using today is from Vensel Enterprises. It's their part number K104-0009. I'm going to be using this tool with either the Luma power supply or the Ace hotspot. The Luma power supply is a bit more powerful and will work a bit better. The Ace works well, but the Luma works a little better. In either case, I strongly recommend using a foot switch. It is almost imperative. You must hold it together and be able to control the heat, and the only way we can control the heat is by cycling it off and on. I have laid out the tools that I'm going to be using. The different holders, the different tips, the different soldering flux, solder flux combined in the syringe, hemostats, Allen wrench, 7/16 3/8 wrench, side cutters, and needle nose pliers. You'll also see the roll of silver solder. In the background you see the different supplies that I will be using to demonstrate this. I will also demonstrate how to solder a single lead, like a field lead or a solenoid lead, back to a stud. First thing we need to do is clean the surface. Since this is a good clean washer, all I am doing now is taking some alcohol and cleaning any amount of excess grease or oil that may happen to be on there. We'll do that first. Next, I will be using some Clean and Bright soldering flux and put a small amount. It don't take much. Next thing I want to do is take the silver solder, this ribbon silver solder, and trim off any excess or anything that's been damaged from the last time we did it. We want a nice clean surface. Next thing I'm going to do is take the hemostats, take the silver solder and the lead and put them together. This way I can hold it with one hand and use the tool with the other hand. Lay the copper lead along with the filler material, the silver solder, between the washer. I'm coming underneath with the carbon probe, coming down with the other half of the piece of equipment. I release that. Now I'm going to apply heat. As I apply heat, you will notice the washer get hot. Once this silver solder flows, it will come loose. Notice I could control the heat. If I felt it was getting too hot, I could stop and redo it again. Again, holding the pliers, holding it tight so that we don't lose the connection. I will remove this and quench it so we can test to see how hard it is to pull apart. Notice the connection. It don't come apart. This time we're going to be using the Silfloss, which is the silver solder and flux mixed together. This is from Vensel Enterprises. Put a small amount on. Again, I'm coming up from underneath. Put the lead on top. Squeeze the two together. And we silver soldered a brush lead to a substrate using the Silfloss. Nice it looks, it's good and tight, held up very, very well. Next important thing is, every so often you do need to clean the tips, especially if it starts sticking. You need to clean if the copper lead sticks to the tool. Clean it, and the cleaner and the smoother you get that, the better off it's going to be. I have silver soldered a brush lead to steel substrates, in this case washers. This side here I use the Silfloss, this side here I use the ribbon solder. I don't know if you can tell how hard I'm pulling and twisting, but they do not come apart. This is a very good way of soldering brush leads to brush holders. We did it here as demonstration, makes it easier to see. I'm going to demonstrate soldering this brush onto this steel substrate. Excellent in that the brushes were cut off and we still saved a bit of copper. This will solder much easier using the sil floss. Made sure the area was nice and clean. Brush goes like so I can take it just like this. Again, coming down from the coming up from underneath with the probe, coming down from the top with the metal piece. Notice how the solder is flown? That is a real nice tight connection. I'm going to solder the other brush on the same way I did the first one. Put a little bit of sil floss on here. And again, if there's copper left, this goes a lot easier. I'm going to take and lay the brush lead on there. I'm coming up from underneath with the carbon probe. I'm coming down from the top with the metal substrate, the metal part of the tool. I heat this up until the brush holder is getting hot. A little bit more. Again, I hold this until the carbon probe cools. Holding it tight keeps a good tight connection. Notice how nice the connection looks. I will quench it and then we'll try to pull it apart. That is a brushes soldered, silver soldered to the substrate. You will notice on the back side that it did get quite hot. And that's what we need. We need to penetrate the heat all the way through to melt the solder all the way up into the brush lead itself. Notice how they may remain flexible. We did not get wicking on this. Next brush holder I'm going to do, someone had attempted to solder brushes on here. Notice the solder. We've got to get every bit of that off, so I'm going to take my sandblaster and blast as much as I can off. Then I'm going to take my Dremel tool and clean it all off. And then we will solder a set of brushes back onto it. This is what the brush holder looks like after we have cleaned it up. I took the Dremel tool and the sandblaster, got all the old solder off. So now I've got a little bit of the old brush left on there. This helps when we get ready to resolder the brushes back on. Makes a better job with we have a little bit of copper left on it. Soldering brushes to this type brush holder, you'll notice that the metal part of here that you normally put down on the top of the brush is actually too wide to fit here. There's a couple things we can do. We can grind that down to be narrower, or in this case what I've done is turned it so I'm going to be coming down with the narrow part like this to hold it in position. I'm going to clean these with a little bit of alcohol with the sandblaster and the Dremel tool. I want to get everything off of there. So I'm cleaning it with a little bit of rubbing alcohol. So let that dry. Then I'm going to put the sil floss. This is the solder, silver solder, and flux all combined. I'm going to take this brush on here, again coming up from underneath to heat up the metal substrate, holding that, positioning that brush and holding it down with the metal top piece. we're done. Still very flexible. We'll do the next one. I've put my Silfoss on this side. I'm getting ready to solder the second brush in. Holding in position, I will apply the heat. We did not get a good connection, so I'm going to wire brush the connections. And we'll do it again. Brushes are soldered to the substrate. Still very flexible. Again, you'll notice the back sides of these have been very hot. That's where we wanted the heat, because that's the hardest thing is to heat up is this metal substrate. If you'll take a look, the filler material filled around the brush lead on both of these very nicely. Excellent. For this next project, I am going to solder a small lead onto the head of a screw. This would be like on the generator field coils, where we need to solder the terminal back on to the field coil. The other end, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to use, instead of the Silfoss, I will use a small piece of silver solder to show you it can be done either one. In order to do that, I'm going to change both tips. Go to a much smaller tip here, and to change this one here to hold the screw. For the metal or the ground, I'm going to be using a bolt that I've drilled the hole off center. That way it gives us a better alignment. I can turn this to make sure that I'm straight under, and I notice a much smaller carbon probe that I'm going to be using. And this way, as this comes down, I want to make sure that I'm directly in the center of this here hole. Like I said, now I'm going to use a smaller tip, and I'm coming down to the point where I'm coming right at that hole. So that way when I drop the screw in, I can be right on the top of that slotted part with the wire in here. Then I can silver solder it back to that stud. Again, this one I'm going to use Silfoss on the one end. I've already taken some little bit of alcohol and cleaned out the groove. Again, I'm going to hold it down like so. You'll notice how we've flowed the Silfoss into that groove around the lead. Good and tight, won't pull apart. Now for this procedure, I like to take and cut a small section of this ribbon silver solder, and I want to bend it in a V shape. Therefore I can drop it down in this groove, put it in the groove of the screw, like so. Bring it into the tool. I'm going to put a little bit of flux on the end of the wire. Lay it in like so. And there we have now silver soldered using the ribbon type solder. Soldered one on one end, using the sil floss on this end, using the ribbon solder on the other end.